April 1942, the island of Panay. Fire blazed from the windows of the school buildings of Central Philippine University, stark white plaster structures pouring out brilliant flames and jet-black smoke. Japanese soldiers with bayoneted rifles swarmed the campus. American forces had used the buildings as a temporary base shortly after the bombing of Iloilo, but with the landing of Japanese troops at 3 locations on Panay 3 days earlier, the soldiers were forced to retreat to the mountains and scattered into the jungle at hidden locations where food and weapons had been stored to begin a guerrilla-style warfare. With the orders to leave nothing behind for the Japanese, they torched the university. Pushing through the leaves while carrying an oversized backpack, Jimmy slapped a mosquito on his neck and came to a stop. If it wasn't one part of his body that hurt, it was another, but at least they were getting closer to their destination. At the head was Reverend Delphine Dianola, who smiled. The bats eat millions of mosquitoes around here, but that still leaves a few billion. Trekking up the steep dirt path in the tropical mountains were Jimmy and Charmer Koval, Frank and Gertrude Rose, a dozen or so teachers, some students, a few local gold miners, and several children of families. Filipino members of Reverend Dianola's church helped haul goods. The displaced teachers dragged their suitcases through a barrage of dark green, glossy-leafed foliage, towering white luan trees, and stands of bamboo. Fearing the deeper penetration of Japanese forces, Jimmy thought it best to move further inland. The rest agreed, so the teachers and other refugees from the university banded together and hiked up into the overgrown mountains of Panay. Reverend Dianola retired his canvas bag on the path and wiped the grime-streaked sweat from his face with a handkerchief. A typically thin Filipino, his sweaty, jet-black hair glistened in the sun as he spoke with a Filipino accent. "We're almost there. Just up over the ridge we'll come to a clearing. You'll see." Rev Dianola, a native Filipino, led a church in the village of Katipunan, about 2 miles away. A number of students and staff from the university fled to the village, but only the Filipinos felt relatively safe from the Japanese. All Caucasians or those deemed American in any way were being told to surrender. Having been befriended by an American family at the university who took him in when he was an orphan, they raised him and gave him a full college education. He took risks for the Americans no one else would, as he knew how much others had risked to take him in off the streets and how much it changed his life. When Jimmy finally broke through the heavier vegetation, he and the group entered into a clearing near the top of the mountain beside a gorge surrounded by steep rocky walls. He looked up at the sun, which pierced the leafy, branched canopy in dozens of columns of light. Majestic mahogany trees lifted their branches to the heavens, alive with dozens of birds and a family of macaque monkeys who swung buoyantly through the branches, chattering with curiosity. 2 tents stood in a small clearing below high-arching trees hanging with vines. Jimmy gazed in awe at the wild orchids, a fascinating display of pink, white and yellow. A brilliant red-bellied peter sang its low whistle song from a nearby branch and flitted away toward a trickling brook that wove its way through a rocky clearing. He closed his eyes and breathed in the sweet scents. It seemed like heaven on earth. Panting, Frank Rose spread out his arms. "Well, this is it. I scouted this out a while back with Reverend Dianola. There are about 20 local families in the area, a creek near B, and we're pretty far from the main roads. Kind of a secret hideout. What do you think?" Charmer kept looking around in wonder and shook her head. "It's so beautiful, so peaceful." "My kind of place," Jimmy added. "Amazing, really." "We'll put up a couple more tents for now," Reverend Dianola said, "and the locals will help you build some bamboo houses. We can help provide food for you as well. In time, you should be able to have a few gardens and be somewhat self-sufficient." Jimmy was grateful for the help of the local reverend and knew much of his story, how he'd been orphaned at a young age, how missionaries had taken him in and later paid his way through school at Jimmy's university, and how he'd gone back to his local people and started a church. He also knew that Rev Dianala was taking risks by helping them. Now it was the missionaries who were homeless and needing help. Jack Treat, a sturdy 6'2" American in a khaki jungle hat, swung the trunk he was carrying to the ground but kept his machine gun over his shoulder. Besides me, there are a few others gold miners and know the area pretty well. Jack was one of many American civilians who had linked up with the guerrillas in recent weeks. A muscular man in his late 20s, it was a natural move from labourer to warrior. "We're in some of the most remote parts of the mountains. No one will find you here, unless you owe 'em money. Then they'll find you." "Isn't that the truth?" Jimmy replied. Though a staunch pacifist, still, he took comfort in his armed escort. Frank stood proudly with his hands on his hips. "I've named it Hope Vale, Valley of Hope." "Hope Vale," Jimmy said. "I like the name. I like everything about this place." Frank smiled and slapped Jimmy on the shoulder. "Maybe God'll bring something good out of this after all, eh?" Precariously perched on the upper frame of his new bamboo hut in progress, Jimmy pulled off his straw hat and smeared the sweat off his forehead onto his equally sweaty arm. It was like a sauna, only with snakes, cockroaches, iguanas, scorpions, and the biggest centipedes he'd ever seen. Fred killed an 11-foot snake in their camp. At least he was off the ground for now. Local Filipinos gladly pitched in to show Jimmy and the others how to build their own nipa huts up on stilts off the damp ground and away from the rats. Men fastened pre-made walls woven of nipa palms with openings for windows shuttered by tilt-out covers held by a stick. He was glad to get a home built, even though he knew it would only be needed for a few months, 6 or so, he figured, until the Americans came to rescue the island from the Japanese. Jimmy looked down at Charmer lugging a sheaf of kogon grass on her back for the roof. "Faster. I can't do this all by myself, you know." "That's real funny." She heaved the load onto the jungle floor. "Let's switch when you get tired of sitting up there." Jimmy tipped his hat, then went back to strapping the bamboo beams to each other with split strands of banban. Others kindled a fire to boil rice for lunch as a local woman led a pig on a rope leash into a makeshift pen. In little over a month, the band of refugee faculty members and teachers had begun to establish themselves in the lush, deeply forested mountains. Fred Meyer couldn't resist opening up the portable SD Reed organ they'd lugged all the way from Iloilo and was dying to give it an airing under the leafy awning. He brushed off the dirt and unlatched the cover as Sina Eriksson, with a bright lavender orchid pinned above her right ear, began assembling her flute. With several Filipino men hacking at bamboo behind him, Fred now sitting on a suitcase before the organ, he looked at Signa and nodded. He closed his eyes and, taking a deep breath, started pumping the pedals to commence Bach's Prelude No. 1 in C major. On cue, Signa released the fluid melody of Charles Gounod's Ave Maria, which mingled perfectly with the fresh mountain air, harmonizing with the entire atmosphere of Hope Vale. As the music filtered through Hope Vale, all paused to enjoy the peace of their safe haven. Even the monkeys stopped swinging between branches to listen. Jenny, a nurse who'd long worked with Dr. Meyer at the hospital, looked up to listen as she hand-fed cooked rice to a small parrot perched on her hand, a Philippine hanging parrot, a bright green red-beaked bird with splashes of red, orange and yellow. She didn't tame the bird. It simply had no fear of people and ate freely from her open palm. The ambience of the music enveloped Jimmy as well. Despite fleeing from his home in Japan and again being driven from the city on Panay, he was filled with gratitude for their new home. Every need was met, and now he was living in a surreal paradise, a haven of peace in a world of war. Nearby, still able to hear the music, Frank Rose had found a high-walled gorge nearby, surrounded by flowering orchids and featuring towering white lawan trees. The shaded small clearing gave him an idea, and he began stacking rocks near the mossy foot of the largest tree to form an altar for an open-air church. Jack, the miner, carried in some reddish rocks that he placed in rows as seats. Earl Rounds, a 7-year-old whose parents were also helping with the construction, was struggling to lift a small boulder. Jack watched in amusement. Jack, help me!" Jack came up behind the boy, reached his arms around him, and the two of them grasped the reddish, flat-topped rock and stacked it on a base with a thud. As he stood upright, Frank squinted while twisting his back to stretch a bit, then asked Jack, "Well, what do you think?" Jack looked up at the vine-covered walls, listened to the chirps of wild birds and the distant sound of Jimmy and Sina on organ and flute, and took a deep breath of the mountain air. "It's nice, real nice." He slumped down onto one of the stone seats. "You see, you can't quite fall asleep in this kind of chair, no matter how boring the message is." Jack pulled Earl onto his lap. "How many seats do you think you'll need?" Frank scanned the area. "Enough for 75 or so." He peered down at his watch. "Oh yeah," he said while tapping his wrist. "They've got the radio working again and we're going to tune in to the report at 2 o'clock. Jimmy stood outside his nearly finished hut, carefully adjusting the dial of the radio sitting on the porch to minimize the sonic squeal, while the silent group of about 30 Americans and Filipinos listened in, some with hands to their faces, others with arms folded and heads cocked in anticipation of the news report. "Good evening, everyone, everywhere. This is the Voice of Freedom broadcasting from somewhere in the Philippines. Bataan has fallen," Chama gasped. "The Philippine-American troops on this war-ravaged and blood-stained peninsula have laid down their arms. With heads bloody but unbowed, they have yielded to the superior force and numbers of the enemy. The world will long remember the epic struggle that Filipino and American soldiers put up in the jungle fastness and along the—" Jimmy's entire posture fell as the weight of the defeat sank in. The breathless group stared at each other in disbelief, and with the sober realization that their hopes were crushed. There would be no rescue or quick victory. J. Chapter 48. April 20th, 1942. Nanchang, China. Ake and the 4 other members of his crew stood stoically on concrete steps leading up to stone columns of a granite block building. 8 Japanese officers in their dress uniforms proudly surrounded them as a photographer stared down into the viewfinder of his camera while holding his hand in the air, motioning the men to be still. Other photographers stood off to the side in front of a growing group of civilian and military spectators. The officers stood erect. Jake did his best to hide a scowl. He felt like a chained monkey in a circus. He was happy to see his lost buddies, who all made it safely to the ground, but into Japanese hands. After they bailed out one by one, they were picked up and interrogated upon threats of death. Jake was tight-lipped, but knew his prospects of making it back home were thin to nothing. After a few shots, the photographer quickly repositioned only the 5 captured flyers with Jake in the front row. Harry nonchalantly puffed on a cigarette he'd bummed off a soldier. With the publicity shots done, the officers blindfolded the flyers, tied their hands together in front of them, and shoved them into the back of a 1938 Ford pickup truck, along with their guards. Then they were hauled off to an airport and loaded into a passenger plane. Where to, Jake didn't know. The idea of taking over the plane was out of the question, as there were 4 guards assigned to each prisoner who was blindfolded and handcuffed to his seat. Although they'd been questioned, amazingly, no one among the Japanese connected them to the Tokyo raid. Not yet. W. Chapter 49. Late April 1942. The battleship Yamato, Hashirajima Bay, 25 miles due south of Hiroshima. We've achieved our objectives far more quickly than we ever imagined, and that with only insignificant Japanese losses, Gender said to the roomful of high-ranking officers. What's left of the American fleet remains paralyzed. General MacArthur deserted his men in the heat of battle, leaving them behind, in the Philippines. And Singapore, the stronghold of the British Empire, fell in a single week, resulting in the largest surrender of British-led forces in history and in a nice prize of Johnny Walker Black Label, which you are now enjoying." The officers chuckled and nodded, others smirked with pride, and still others raised their drinks and surveyed the faces of their peers. Curls of smoke drifted up from cigarettes. Fuchida, who had personally experienced the exhilaration of uncontested victorias, likewise beamed and took a victorious sip of his whiskey. Isoroku Yamamoto, the highly respected admiral of the Combined Fleet, had gathered his top commanders and their select staff to his flagship, the mighty battleship Yamato. She and her sister ship, Musashi, were the most powerful and massive battleships ever to ply the seas, displacing 78,200 metric tons, 50% heavier than the biggest and newest Colorado-class battleships of the U.S. Navy. A single-gun turret of the Yamato weighed more than the largest American destroyer. Yet the Yamato was so luxuriously appointed that sailors began calling it the Yamato Hotel, both a compliment and an insult. Still, she was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Seated along both sides of the long table were the leading commanders of the Navy in their dark blue uniforms trimmed with gold braids. Their combined forces had attained the objectives of securing new lands rich with oil, rice, rubber, and other resources needed by their empire, quickly and with minimal losses. The Japanese had hurled the Americans to the floor before the eyes of the world, dealt the British Indian fleet a humiliating defeat, and had completely overrun the Dutch forces. Never had they imagined achieving so much so soon, and they found themselves in the unexpected position of needing to choose their next conquest as a stunned world sat and watched. Lieutenant Commander Genda stood near the front, completing his remarks on behalf of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, before Yamamoto presented his newest strategy. Fuchida sat beside Genda's empty chair, listening attentively. "All have exemplified outstanding Bushido spirit in the service of our august emperor," Genda continued. "The sun has finally set on the British Empire, as it rises on our own." Genda bowed briefly to applause and headed to his seat as Yamamoto rose from his position at the head of the table. When Genda returned to his seat, Fuchida looked up with a smile and nod of approval. But Fuchida was more interested in hearing Yamamoto, as there had been rumblings among the ranks about whether the IJN should first head east to deal with the Americans, or head south first, then deal with the Americans. Both groups believed that the aircraft carriers of the American fleet had to be destroyed, but disagreed on how and when to do so. The southern operation, as it had come to be known, was favoured by many. They were concerned that the Allies would use Australia as a staging area to attack the Japanese and retake lost territory, so it remained a weak point on their perimeter. They wanted to concentrate their forces in order to occupy it and cut it off from Allied support. But Fuchida felt this was simply wasting time and taking resources from what he saw as the primary goal: destroying the remaining American carriers as quickly as possible, then bringing the conflict to a resolution through negotiations. "Gentlemen," Yamamoto began, "we have reached an agreement with the Naval General Staff in Yokosuka on the next plan of operations. The Americans have done us a favour by their foolish air raid. They say, a bungling attack is better than the most skillful defence. True enough, but they've made clear to us that their carriers must be destroyed immediately. This was our missed objective in the Pearl Harbor operation, but we will not fail this time." Fuchida began to smile as he leaned forward. "In their weakened position and low morale, they won't venture a serious attack, so we will carry out Imperial General Headquarters Navy Order No. 18, the seizure and occupation of Midway Island." Several admirals nodded with approval. Fuchida immediately looked down and exhaled abruptly. Midway is a strategic island they cannot afford to lose, yet at over 1,000 miles from Oahu, it's beyond the reach of their land-based fighters. They'll be forced to send their carriers and whatever remaining strength to come to its defence, where we'll be waiting with the overwhelming force to crush them. Yamamoto's eyes gleamed. Vice Admiral Nagumo cleared his throat. "Admiral, When do you propose launching this attack? There will be a full moon on June 1st, as close as possible to this date. Murmurs filtered through the room. Fuchida's mind began to swirl. He couldn't fathom launching such a colossal attack in only 5 weeks. The Pearl Harbor attack had taken months of planning, practice, and tremendous organization of resources, and that was against an unprepared enemy. This time the enemy would most likely be ready, or at least watchful, and the battle would require far greater resources. Yamamoto looked out with authority. Much later, and we won't have adequate moonlight for night maneuvers on the beaches. Time is not in our favor. The balance of power will shift to the Americans if they're allowed to rebuild while retaining their surviving carriers. He turned to Nagumo. You will command our 6 aircraft carriers, with Fuchida initiating the air attack on Midway. You will destroy their aircraft both on the ground and in the air to prepare for the occupation of the island. Then your fleet will provide air protection for the main fleet of 7 battleships, their support ships and troop carriers when they arrive for the landing of 5,000 infantrymen on Midway 2 days later. Fuchida tried not to sigh. It seemed like too much too soon. The Americans cannot react in fewer than 3 days from the time we begin. With over 200 ships amassed for this battle, we will overwhelm and destroy any force the Americans could possibly respond with. Hawaii and the entire west coast of the United States will be exposed and unprotected. After 2 months of continued operations in the Southeast Pacific, we will take Hawaii, and they will be forced to the bargaining table. They'll be left with little choice but to negotiate terms for peace favorable to Japan. As a junior officer, Fuchida was pushing things to venture any comments in such a setting, but he felt compelled to speak. He inhaled cautiously. Admiral, please excuse me for speaking, but as you are well aware, Admiral Nagumo and the 1st Air Fleet have completed 4 months of demanding service covering over 50,000 nautical miles. Our ships and aircraft are in need of repair, and the pilots may need time to recuperate in order to perform at their best before such a significant— Out of the question. We must act now. This will be the decisive battle in the Pacific. Then we will have an impenetrable defensive perimeter to prevent another attack against our homeland. He pounded his fist on the table. I am determined to never again allow American bombers over Tokyo to threaten our emperor. Late April 1942, the Imperial Palace. Emperor Hirohito reclined in a stuffed sable-brown leather chair, alone in a darkened room, the smoke of his cigarette illuminated by a movie projector clattering behind his right shoulder. He gazed without expression at Donald Duck, hopelessly trying to free himself from a folding beach chair in the Disney film Donald's Vacation. A servant arrived with tea on an inlaid wooden tray. Without turning his eyes, the Emperor inquired, "Where did you say they found this again?" "Guam, Your Majesty, when we took the island in December." The Emperor picked up the teacup from the tray and looked back at the screen. "It's very funny," he said plainly. "Yes, Your Majesty." "May I get you anything else?" He gave no answer as he sipped his tea and studied an angry, frustrated Donald Duck trapped in his misfolded chair, quacking curses at a string of chipmunks stealing his food. A smile crept across the Emperor's lips. "You see?" He glanced at the servant, then pointed at the screen. "Even the big duck is trapped by his love of luxury and easily defeated by a group of smaller creatures with fighting spirit." Rasping his bamboo sword with both hands beside his head, Fuchida lunged at Genda, who parried off the glance. "This is nonsense!" Fuchida exclaimed. "Of course Tokyo will be bombed again." Below decks in a cleared-out storagere of scuffed walls, Fuchida and Genta, both barefoot, traded blows with Shinai in the martial art of kendo on the matted floor. They were dressed in traditional broad, black pants and full protective gear, black canvas helmets with wide flaps and ribbed metal masks, padded gauntlets and black leather breastplates. "Move the Emperor to Kyoto or Nara," Fuchida said angrily, "but we shouldn't be taking a defensive posture." He lunged again with a strike toward Genda's head. Gender quickly deflected it with a crack and countered with a strike at Fuchida. "A samurai carries no shield," Fuchida said. With the outlawing of the samurai class in the 19th century, they faded from their prior position of status, but the age-old martial art of kendo, the way of the sword, found its place in the early 20th century. The sport grew in popularity, eventually being performed before the emperor himself. Along with restoring the values of Bushido, the way of the warrior, the samurai code of conduct kendo honed the mind and body as a classical warrior. "If we can draw out their carriers, we'll defeat them," Gender said between breaths. "The Americans have little left to fight with. It would be nearly impossible for them to put up much fight at all." Fuchida lowered his shinai and stepped up to Gender. "What a nonsensical operation. Our battleships will be 300 miles behind us. What the hell can they do with those guns back there? At least if they were ahead of us, they could help defend the carriers. That's where we need them." Fuchida angrily jerked his shinai up into a defensive posture and stepped back. Gender leapt forward with a series of violent swings that Fuchida fended off. "I don't think we'll need them," Gender said. Fuchida stood erect and gestured with his free hand. "And why would the Americans risk their remaining carriers to defend a tiny island? What if they don't come out at all? When we take the island, how will we defend it from 4,000 miles away?" Fuchida crouched again and circled to his right, raising his shinai. "If we cut off Australia from American support by attacking Fiji and Samoa," he lunged forward and struck Gender on the shoulder, "then launch another full-scale attack against Pearl Harbor. That will bring out their fleet." Panting, Gender pushed up his helmet to reveal his sweaty head wrapped in cotton cloth. "The plan is decided." He pulled off his helmet and unwrapped his head, as did Fuchida, who wiped the sweat from his face with the cloth. Gender continued, panting. "But then you knew that, from the beginning. Once Yamamoto made up his mind, he had set his course." The two retired to a storage closet. Fuchida said, "We're rushing into a plan without the ability to prepare." Gender untied the straps of his gauntlets and tossed them on a shelf one at a time. "By the way, we've recovered some of the American B-25s in China. They ran out of fuel and crashed." Fuchida looked at Gender with keen interest, the sweat dripping down his cheeks. "They were medium bombers fitted with extra fuel tanks for a one-way long-range attack, we now think from a carrier. They were to land in China from the start. That's how they did it." Unfastening his breastplate, Fuchida paused, then nodded. Yankee ingenuity. He picked up a pack of cigarettes, shook one out, and raised it to his lips. "Very clever." Late April 1942, Madras, Oregon. Mrs. Andrus dumped a scoop of grain into a pail as hungry horses in their stalls anxiously leaned out and pawed the sawdust. As she dug the scoop into the barrel of grain, her red merle Australian shepherd let out a howl and a string of barks. She turned to see two black sedans pull up to the barn and skid to a stop. 4 men in suits stumbled out with notepads. She knew it was good news or bad news about Jake, and feared the worse. "Excuse me, ma'am," the first one shouted as he trotted up and tipped his fedora. "Are you Mrs. Andrus, the mother of Jacob de Shazer?" "That I am," she said politely. "We're from the Oregon Journal." "And the Oregonian," another declared, "and would just like to get some details, and maybe a picture of your son Jake." "He's a hero," a third reporter chimed in. Goosebumps skimmed over her back and arms. She'd read about Jake's adventure like everyone else, but with the joy only a mother could understand. Now the press wanted to know more. The Doolittle raid brought a boost to US morale across the country, but in the tiny town of Madras, where wheat prices and weather were big news, word that one of their own was part of the bold attack on Japan was sensational. "That's Jake all over," Mrs. Andrus said proudly. "He's daring. Would never do anything that looked like a sissy." The reporters scrawled furiously. From the first, he wanted to get into the fight, said he'd like to go over and help lick the Japs. "Are you concerned about him?" the first reporter asked. Mrs. Andrus dumped another scoop of grain into the pail. She looked at the reporters with a smile. "The last note he sent me said, 'Don't worry about me, Mom. I'm in no danger.'" She carried the pail and leaned over the stall fence and dumped the grain into a bucket hanging beside a black horse. The fourth reporter in a tan suit spoke up. "You know he hasn't been located yet. If he falls into Jap hands, can he take the torture they dish out?" Mrs. Andrus stopped and turned to the reporter and looked him in the eye, her gentle smile turning into a hard glare. "I said he's no sissy." Late April 1942. Nanking, 17. China. Blindfolded, unshaven and filthy, Jake sat in a darkened room at a small table with his wrists cuffed together on his lap. He had little to eat the past few days, and even less sleep. Neither did he have any idea where he really was, and had completely lost track of time. His wrists ached. A Japanese officer sat across from him at the table lit by a single hanging lamp. 3 soldiers stood or leaned against the wall to the side, curiously observing. The officer snarled in English, "Who sent you on this mission?" Jake gave no reply. "Where did you fly from?" Jake remained steadfast. "Where did you fly from?" Jake knew what he was supposed to do. "My name is Jacob DeShazer, Corporal, U.S. Army Air Corps, serial number 0658. "Idiot! Don't you know what we can do to you? We'll torture you and then we'll shoot you." The interrogator stood up abruptly, knocking his own chair back onto the floor with a crack. He walked up beside Jake, leaned down, and spoke softly. "Did you know we have bombed San Francisco?" He moved right up to Jake's face. "We now occupy the city. Right now, our emperor is riding his white horse down the streets of your city." He paused a moment, then burst into cackling laughter. He turned to one of the soldiers and blurted out in Japanese, "Take him to Kuroyama." 2 soldiers clenched his arms, hoisted him to his feet, and dragged him out the door. In his darkness, Jake could tell they led him up a couple of flights of stairs. Then he was shoved into another room where a soldier finally untied his black blindfold. Jake squinted and blinked as he stood in the harsh light, staring at a short, stocky officer puffing on a cigar on the other side of a table scattered with papers. Several other soldiers surrounded him. The officer rubbed his hands together, then plucked the cigar from his mouth. "I wish you to know that I want to treat you good," the officer said with a British accent. He pointed at Jake. "Very good. I have the reputation of being the kindest judge in all of China. You know this? You're lucky to have me question you. You answer my questions and I'll get you a glass of milk." He once again sucked the smoke from his stogie. Jake looked around the room at his captors when a soldier from behind yelled something in Japanese and forced him down into a chair. The officer carefully slid some papers in front of Jake, all the while staring into his eyes. The water-stained sheets of paper were burned along one edge. The hair stood up on Jake's neck. It was a roster of the entire list of men on the Doolittle raid retrieved from one of the wrecked B-25s. Jake pretended not to care. The records should have been destroyed by the crews before ditching the aircraft. Fools. The officer confidently blew a cloud of smoke. "You and your friends, eh?" He waited for an answer. "Do you know this Doolittle?" Jake stared at the wall. "I've heard of him. I think he's a stunt pilot." He swallowed hard with a dry throat. Man, was he thirsty. The officer pounded his fist on the table. "Look at me when you answer." Jarred, but retaining his composure, Jake stared again into the officer's eyes, who quickly diverted his own away. The officer paced and came back to the table. "Where are the Chinese hiding their gasoline?" Jake knew that, as a prisoner of war, he was only required to give his name, rank, and serial number. But he also knew that, although the Japanese signed the Geneva Convention, they never ratified it, and didn't have such a good reputation when it came to Chinese prisoners of war. But all that didn't even matter now, since he really didn't know. "Where is it?" the officer said. Again, Jake looked up into the officer's face. "I don't know, and if I did, I wouldn't say." Perturbed, the officer glanced over to the other soldiers, then back to Jake. "What does Hornet spell?" "Hornet." "And what is that?" Jake thought for a second. "It's a bug." He raised his cuffed hands and gestured with his fingers. "A kind of wasp that—" The officer slapped his hand on the papers. "That is the name of the aircraft carrier you flew from to bomb Japan, isn't it?" Jake stared at his flat hand on the papers, then looked him back in the eyes. "I wouldn't know. I'm not in the Navy. I'm in the Army Air Corps." "And Doolittle was your commanding officer, right? You know I can't answer that question." Slowly walking to Jake's side of the table, the officer drew his sword from its scabbard and with both hands suspended it above Jake's head. "It's considered a great honour for a judge to cut off the head of a prisoner. Tomorrow at sunrise I will have this honour." He lowered his sword while staring at Jake, then slowly sheathed it. "What do you think about that?" He crossed his arms firmly. Jake sat stoically, gazing at the wall in front of him. "I think it would be a great honour for me to have the kindest judge in all of China cut off my head." The room burst into chuckles, and the officer smiled and nodded. Jake showed no emotion. "Takashita," the officer said, staring at Jake with admiration, "go get him a glass of milk." Early the next morning, Jake stood before an aging concrete wall, handcuffed and blindfolded. He'd barely slept the previous night while still handcuffed on a bare wooden floor with no blankets, and he hadn't eaten in a day, other than the cup of milk he accidentally won. Nothing seemed to matter to him now, and it showed in his hunched posture. He could hear the men speaking among themselves and discerned clicking of sticks of some kind. From what he'd been told, you didn't really feel a thing when they cut off your head. They used pretty sharp swords. They even made a game of it sometimes. Would his mome ever know what happened, or why? He wasn't sure why himself. He tried to swallow. "Are you ready?" one soldier said to another in Japanese. "I'm ready!" a soldier exclaimed in English. "Prisoner, stand up straight." Jake straightened up a bit. He was as ready as he'd ever be. "Okay, go ahead." Someone slid off Jake's blindfold, and he strained his eyes in daylight sun. Another soldier unlocked his handcuffs. Jake looked for the officer with the sword, but only saw a group of soldiers around a camera on a tripod. He was confused and, in a strange way, almost disappointed. "You want me to smile or something?" Jake said. "Be still." A shutter clicked. The photographer wound the film forward, then clicked again. "Take him to the airport with the others," the photographer said, motioning to a soldier. "Put the blindfold and handcuffs back on." May 1st, 1942. The battleship Yamato. Hashirajima Bay, 25 miles south of Hiroshima. The late afternoon sun shimmered on the peaceful waves as the fleet sat at rest. Inside the Yamato, it was war. Admiral Yamamoto and a crowd of officers anxiously stared down on a map table big enough to park a car on, watching an aide push markers across the chart for their war games. His guts were taut. The turning of the entire Pacific War would hinge on this single battle, a plan of his own making. A runner strode up to Vice Admiral Nagumo, saluted, then held out a note with his other hand. This was day one of the war games, and Nagumo's forces were engaging Midway by aerial assault, just like he'd done at Pearl Harbor. "Sir, Red Team sends attack aircraft against the carrier strike force." Yamamoto watched Gender shake his head and unconsciously roll his lit cigarette between his fingers as a scorekeeper placed a set of tiny red aircraft to the flank of Nagumo's fleet. The operation depended on surprise. Everyone knew that anything less could be disastrous. This was a bad start for the games. Ugaki, the judge, frowned. Such tactics are impossible on such short notice. An air attack from Midway would need to have been fully anticipated, and an attack from a carrier could only be from forces positioned and also fully prepared for such a strike. The map displayed Japan, part of Russia, the Aleutian Islands, and the Hawaiian Islands, an area comprising over 15,000 square miles. Just southeast of the centre of the map was a red pin marking the nearly invisible and previously unimportant Midway Atoll, a tiny barrier reef with a few sand islets at the far northwestern tip of the Hawaiian island chain. Every high-ranking officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy surrounded the table and intently peered down on the clusters of blue miniature wooden warships representing the various Japanese strike and occupation forces. Red miniatures represented the American surface forces. With the advent of the Doolittle raid, Yamamoto had finally won the battle with headquarters to gain approval of his plan to attack the Americans at Midway, but they mandated that the plan be tested by the sharpest minds on his staff. They insisted Yamamoto put all doubts to rest before engaging in battle. War games were serious business. Yamamoto, a keen poker player, knew that even the slightest error could result in disaster. It was in this gambling den that the commanders had to predict the unpredictable and expect the unexpected to ensure the success of their mission. The capture of Midway and the destruction of the American carriers were only a part of an ambitious and complex second phase of the war. Faltering here could be catastrophic, and Yamamoto knew it more than any of them. For these wargame exercises, Combined Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Ugaki acted both as Commander-in-Chief of the Blue Japanese Forces and as judge. The commanders of the Red American Forces directed their navies from two other rooms. Yamamoto's plan was for Vice Admiral Nagumo, leader of the Pearl Harbor attack, to once again lead the critical carrier strike force, this time against Midway. Gender stood beside him, both literally and figuratively. Admiral Yamamoto, the highest-ranking officer in the room, would lead the main force of the combined fleet, 300 miles southwest to the rear of Nagumo's forces to keep himself hidden from the Americans. By the time the US forces came to defend their island, they would be ambushed by the overwhelming combined force of Nagumo's attack carriers and of Yamamoto's battleships. At least, that's what he'd planned and hoped. After capturing Midway and destroying the American fleet, he would send his forces down to the northeast of Australia to take New Caledonia and Fiji to establish further bases and cut off the Americans from Australia. Finally, within 2 months of the Midway invasion, Yamamoto would send the full force of the combined fleet to attack and occupy Hawaii. The war would be over. America would have to accept Japanese terms. These sweeping, complicated and untested strategies were to be proven over 4 days of intense war games. Yamamoto expected that only one bloody-fisted fighter would be left standing in this high-stakes winner-takes-all deathmatch, but he was impatient and anxious to be done with the games and to get underway into battle. The games were perfunctory to him, simply to please headquarters. An umpire with a black cup in his hand containing 2 dice stood motionless waiting for Yamamoto, hunched over the edge of the map, leaning on his outstretched arms. He was torn between wanting success and fearing compromising the very purpose of the games. After a few very long seconds, Yamamoto looked up from the top of his eyes at the umpire and nodded. The murmuring in the room dissolved into the hollow rattling of dice in the cup held against the officer's hand. He slapped the cup to the table and slowly raised it, revealing a 5 and a 4. The officers sucked air through their teeth. Nagumo folded his arms and glared at Gender. 9 enemy hits on blue team carriers Akagi and Kaga, the umpire announced stiffly. Both aircraft carriers destroyed. A scorekeeper leaned out, placing black markers on the 2 carriers in the deadly quiet room. Yamamoto rubbed his cheek hard. An enemy arrow had found the chink in his armor. His eyes moved to read Nagumo's face. He saw fear. Ugaki broke the silence. "Reduce enemy hits to 3. The scorekeeper froze. Ugaki continued. Kaga sunk, Akagi slightly damaged but operable. Such an attack is highly unlikely. Yamamoto stood upright as the scorekeeper briefly glanced at him before removing the black marker from the Akagi. Yamamoto turned toward Nagumo. If your aircraft were occupied with the attack on Midway, what would you do if an enemy force appeared on your flank? Nagumo swallowed and sighed, bidding for time. Although he was the commander of the attack force, he was an old-school battleship commander who lacked the expertise of air tactics that Genta developed, who promptly responded on his behalf. No matter where or when we meet the Americans, we will prevail. We have more aircraft, we have better aircraft, and we have far more experience. We're simply better than they are. We'll wipe them out. Yamamoto nodded, but without the confidence he had shown in the past. The games were fanning the fears and doubts he had hoped would be doused by now. Captain Miwa spoke up. Admiral, this matter is of small concern. Our Navy has accumulated an unrivaled string of victories against all adversaries in the Pacific, and we're bringing superior forces to this battle. As Commander Genda has stated, our experience is unparalleled. The Americans are mere beginners. Our defensive powers are unbreakable. Yamamoto spoke quietly. Are you forgetting the Battle of the Coral Sea? Admiral, Miwa continued, the Americans suffered twice the losses we did in raw tonnage of warships. They lost a fleet carrier, we only a light carrier. But the Americans prevented us from achieving our objective of securing Port Moresby, didn't they? The room remained silent to Yamamoto. He looked at Nagumo. I want constant air protection by Zero fighters, and I want half of all attack aircraft held in reserve and equipped with torpedoes for a quick counterstrike against surface units. We must be prepared for enemy carriers if they're discovered earlier than we've anticipated. Nagumo nodded. I'm counting on Fuchida to lead this attack. Yamamoto's piercing eyes spoke louder than his words, as he then looked from face to face around the room, seeking traces of fear. He felt the gnats of doubt pestering his own mind as he peered back down, focusing on the tiny red aircraft on the table. He had gambled big at Hawaii and won against all odds. One last bet to win it all, or lose it all. He sighed heavily, slowly lifting his eyes to a porthole and gazed out to the ocean horizon in the fading light beyond. Sir, Nagumo said confidently, there is no better pilot in the Imperial Navy. We will succeed. May 27th, 1942. 1 week before the battle. Fuchida stared up dejectedly at Genda from his hospital bed. Clenching his teeth and shutting his eyes between spasms, he turned his head. You picked a fine time for appendicitis, Genda said, turning his head quickly to cough to the side. Next to him at Fuchida's bedside in the all-white infirmary room stood Vice Admiral Nagumo and Rear Admiral Kusaka, respectively Commander-in-Chief and Chief of Staff of the 1st Air Fleet. The doctor yanked Fuchida's shirt back over his abdomen. He needs to be transferred to a destroyer and taken to Beppo, the nearest military hospital for surgery, he said. Immediately. No! Fuchida opened his eyes widely and peered up at the doctor. He couldn't believe his bad luck. Not him, not here, not now. The pain was blinding, but he struggled to speak. The Akagi serves as the Task Force Surgical Center and is perfectly capable of performing an appendectomy. Fuchida, Genda pleaded, you need to go. Genda coughed and hacked some more. Fuchida shook his head. The doctor looked to Nagumo for some sort of response, then at Fuchida. We'll have to put you under general anesthesia. You'll need to... No, just use local anesthesia. Fuchida squinted again through the pain. Even if I can't fly, I can at least be on hand for consultation. I need to be in my right mind. And I'm not leaving the Akagi. The doctor shook his head and spoke to Nagumo. He must stay in bed for at least a week. He won't be able to fly for some time. 2 weeks after surgery at least. Nagumo nodded to the doctor, then let out an angry sigh. 2 of our 6 carriers have failed to join the fleet because of damage from the battle in the Coral Sea. He rubbed the back of his neck and scanned Fuchida head to toe, then threw his arm out. Now this! He turned and stormed out of the room, followed by Kusaka. You look lousy, pal, Genda said. You don't look so good yourself. Fuchida looked up helplessly at Genda. Lieutenant Tomonaga on the Hiryu will lead. He's a very capable pilot. Genda gazed back soberly. Fuchida's eyes said it all. Their chances for victory were slipping away. June 4th, 1942, 3 a.m. The aircraft carrier Akagi, 250 miles northwest of Midway Island. 19 oil-fired Campon boilers generating a combined 132,000 horsepower propelled the Akagi through the calm morning darkness at battle speed 3, full speed. In the control bridge wrapped in 4-foot-high glass windows, Vice Admiral Nagumo looked down on the idling aircraft on the deck, outlined by dim running lights, while the captain slowly brought the enormous 850-foot floating runway into the wind. Pilots impatiently idled the thunderous engines of their fighters, white and blue flames flaring from their exhaust pipes in the morning darkness. In his hospital bed far below decks, Fuchida awoke with a start, the distant rumble of aircraft engines calling him like the voice of an old friend. Doctor's orders or not, nothing could or should stop him, the chief flight commanding officer, from making his way to the deck to see his men off. He wasn't going to lie there like a dying animal on the greatest day of the Imperial Navy. 2 other patients in beds beside him seemed asleep, so Fuchida slowly sat up but instantly fell back from the pain of his healing wound. He pulled up his gown to examine his incision for a second, then yanked it back down. It looked okay to him. Who cared what the surgeon said? With childlike enthusiasm, he tossed off his blanket and rolled onto his side, carefully slid from his bed and threw on a robe. "Commander," one of the patients said quietly, "should you be getting out of bed?" Fuchida stopped for a moment and responded boyishly, "I can't bear to hear the sound of the engines and stay in sick bay." He paused. "You understand." The patient smiled and nodded. No need for any explanation. The doors had been sealed for battle conditions, so Fuchida twisted the large crank of the manhole cover in the centre of the door to let himself through, wincing with needles of pain. He felt light-headed and faint as he stepped through and retightened the hatch. Grasping the handrail, he squatted in the passageway to catch his breath. He repeated the ordeal over 10 times through a maze of hatches and ladders, to finally make it to his bunk where his sweaty body collapsed with quivering pain. But the shuddering roar of each revving engine relentlessly drew him to the deck above. Collecting himself, he quickly wiped off with a washcloth, shaved, dressed in his uniform, and emerged in the lower aircraft hangar. Under incandescent lights, dozens of engineers in their white jumpsuits fueled and armed the next group of aircraft with bombs for use against land targets. Fuchida made his way through the maze of olive-green aircraft. The paint randomly flaked off the aluminum skin by the salt air and constant service, each tied down over its own white outline for position. The familiar smell of grease, fuel and paint, the clatter of ratchets, and shouts of team members below, and the rumble of aircraft above deck were invigorating to him. He'd walked this deck 100 times before, but this time each detail was vivid. The blood surged through his veins. He loved his ship. He loved his crew. He couldn't wait to get to the flight deck. "Commander, are you all right?" Kanagasaki, Fuchida's engineer from the Pearl Harbor attack, was overseeing 4 men jack up an 1,800-pound bomb under a Nakajima B-5N bomber when he noticed the commander. "Kanagasaki, I'm fine. Anyway," he said with a shrug, "I can't be in bed under circumstances like these." With a broad smile and a nod, Fuchida kept his posture and stride, never giving a hint of his pain. The eastern horizon was just beginning to lighten from the dawn when he finally arrived on the flight deck of 31 idling aircraft, humming in a deafening chorus. Physically drained by his obstacle course, Fuchida leaned against the sandbagged encased tower or island on the port side of the carrier. "Are you all right?" a busy air officer shouted out as he trotted past. Fuchida nodded and waved, put his hands on his knees, and slowly lowering himself to lie down on the deck beside the tower. The Akagi had flashed a message to the other 3 carriers from her signal lamp that all was ready, and they flashed back that they were prepared as well. From the bridge crowded with officers, Vice Admiral Nagumo gave the command, "Launch the air attack force." The air officer below blew his whistle and swung his green lantern in a huge circle, signalling the first pilot to take to the air. A flagman waved a white flag toward the front of the ship. Crewmen cheered, waving their white caps as the first fighter let loose his full throttle and roared down the runway out over the ocean. A nearby engineer kindly slid a parachute under Fuchida's head as he strained to watch. He was a proud father, even though sidelined. The first few fighters from each carrier remained circling the fleet as part of the combat air patrol to guard against possible attack. One by one, the rest of the fighters and bombers from the 4 carriers, the Akagi, the Soryu, the Hiryu, and the Kaga, quickly joined into their respective formations and headed off to Midway Island. Radio silence had been mandated, so no one on board would know anything until the attack was nearly complete and the results had been sent back via radio telegraph. All was now in the hands of Fuchida's pilots. 5:31 a.m. Vice Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge peering through a pair of long-range pedestal-mounted binoculars, steadily scanning the ocean, now clearly outlined by the glowing orange sky as the sun began to break the horizon. Messages crackled over the ship's intercom in the background. Seeing nothing, he stepped back and looked head to toe at Gender standing beside him, in his pyjamas, a white kimono-style robe, looking terrible. "I thought you'd gone to sick bay with pneumonia," Nagumo remarked. Gender forced a smile. "Sir, they don't know I'm up here." Nagumo turned to a newly arrived aide. "What's the report on the first launch?" The aide saluted. "Admiral, 74 attack aircraft with 36 escort fighters en route to Midway Island. 11 combat air patrol fighters over the fleet." Nagumo returned to his binoculars. "Any sighting of the American fleet from our reconnaissance aircraft?" "None, sir. We're still waiting for communication from our scouts." Giving a perturbed glance at Gender, then back to the dawn sky, he exclaimed, "Get in uniform, will you?" "Yes, sir," Gender replied sheepishly. He saluted and exited in haste. Nagumo's air fleet possessed cruisers fitted with float planes with the sole task of searching for enemy warships by radiating out from the fleet to about 300 miles, then returning in a pattern like the petals of a daisy. 7 of these scout planes had been launched at the same time as the attack aircraft, around 4:30 a.m. "Sir!" Rear Admiral Kusaka dialed in the focus of his binoculars. "It appears that the cruiser Nagara is beginning to lay down a smoke screen up ahead." "Their lookouts may have spotted enemy aircraft," Gender added. "Now the Kirishima is also laying down smoke," Kusaka continued. Nagumo was unperturbed. "Double combat air patrol. 5:56 a.m., Midway Island." In a sky pocked with hundreds of burst anti-aircraft fire, Japanese dive bombers dropped into their bombing runs at steep angles, engines screaming, and released their explosives, engulfing the tiny island in flames and smoke. Zero fighters strafed buildings and aircraft hangars as a fuel storage tank erupted into a billowing fireball. 16 aging American fighters engaged the attacking band and managed to down 6 or 7 Japanese aircraft before they were systematically blown from the air by their more experienced opponents. 6:41 a.m. A messenger approached Nagumo, bowed and held out a note from the telegraph office. The Akagi was sailing southeast of a brilliant sunrise reflecting over the ocean. Nagumo plucked the note and quickly scanned it, shook his head and looked back out at the horizon as he spoke to Genda. Air Commander Tomonaga requests a second attack wave to finish the job at Midway. We're going to need planes irradiated with land bombs, Nagumo said. All were hoping the first wave from the 4 carriers would do the job, but Nagumo was also prepared to hear that the defences of Midway had not been fully disabled, as he was denied the attack aircraft of 2 carriers that were supposed to have joined his fleet. To successfully land the invasion required overcoming the American defences, especially their ability to launch aircraft. "Sir," Genda said hesitantly, "excuse me, but we recognize that Admiral Yamamoto specifically ordered the reserves to be equipped with torpedoes in the event we discover the American fleet. It could take as long as 2 hours to dismount and rearm our aircraft with land bombs, and then we wouldn't be prepared to attack the American fleet if they appear." Nagumo looked away with a scowl. 7:10 a.m. Lying on the deck just below the tower in the ocean breeze, Fuchida jotted notes on a piece of scrap paper. A team of 12 men pushed a light grey Zero off the elevator onto the grease-stained deck, spotting it with the group for the next launch. As the new fighters warmed their roaring engines, Fuchida began to feel somewhat better and slowly got to his feet. Not so bad. Ignoring the ache in his belly, he walked to the front of the tower and looked far to his left, then to his right at the other carriers, also sending fighters into the air for protection. He wondered if there'd been any word back on the attack at Midway. Just as he was about to make his way up to the bridge, he heard shouting from a lookout above him. 2 groups of enemy aircraft approaching from the southeast." Fuchida shielded the sun from his eyes and strained to see the aircraft that appeared like small dots just above the horizon, dead ahead. Lacking radar, the fleet relied on keen-eyed lookouts for early detection of the enemy. From the bridge, Captain Aoki shouted into the speaking tube, "Flank speed! Hard to port!" which threw the ship into a huge left-handed turn, making the Akagi a more difficult target, while also giving her battery of anti-aircraft guns full aim at the approaching assailants. In the air above, Fuchida could see the Zeros falling swiftly toward the advancing bandits, TBF Avengers armed with torpedoes, which comprised the first group. These slow-moving, low-flying aircraft needed to get within close range to have any chance of success, and had somehow been separated from their fighter escorts. They were easy prey to the lethal Zeros who riddled them with machine gun and cannon fire, downing them one by one in eruptions of streaking fireballs that fell twisting into the sea, ending in plumes of white ocean mist. But TBF Avengers were equipped with powerful rear-facing 50 caliber guns, whose fire managed to send a Zero tumbling in flames into the sea as well. Despite the lashing, Fuchida watched intently as several American bombers managed to drop their deadly fish toward their targets before breaking off under heavy fire from both fighters and anti-aircraft guns, peppering the sky with exploding shells and tracers as the bombers turned away. As the huge Akagi circled again in the opposite direction, Fuchida scrambled to the port side of the deck in time to see several torpedoes bubble past in the distance. He looked across the water to their sister carrier Hiryu, as she also managed to steer clear of approaching torpedoes. No hits. Fuchida smirked. The Americans were foolish to try an unescorted attack, he thought. They seemed so inexperienced. Just then, 4 more enemy aircraft were coming into view, and he could see they were twin-engine bombers, approaching at a speed so fast the fighters had trouble keeping them in their line of attack as they opened fire from above. He trotted back to the tower. Because the Akagi was twisting and turning in a giant figure 8, Genda and Nagumo on the bridge had a hard time keeping track of where the enemy was approaching from, but on the open deck, Fuchida could clearly follow the planes as he watched the converging anti-aircraft fire being thrown up by every ship into the sky. A fireball shot out from the engine of one of the approaching bombers, sending the plane down, trailing black cotton smoke all the way until it crashed into the ocean. Just as quickly, a Japanese fighter took a hit and spiraled downward, ending in a splash of mist. In the midst of hellacious fire from all sides, all three remaining twin-engine B-26 Marauders splashed their torpedoes into the sea toward the Akagi. Taking full advantage of its flight path, one of the Marauders unloaded its machine guns at the Akagi, panging the ship with bullets and sending Fuchida leaping behind a huge electric winch for protection. Two gunners on the Akagi were not as lucky. After the plane roared past, Nagumo breathed a sigh of relief, but as the ship continued in a hard right turn to avoid the incoming torpedoes, an officer on the far right of the bridge turned to Nagumo. "Admiral?" Genda, Nagumo, and the entire group of nearly a dozen bridge officers instantly looked right and stared in disbelief as the last B-26 hurtled directly toward their control tower in a suicide run through a furious crossfire of anti-aircraft rounds pounding the sky. Standing on the deck below, Fuchida fixed his eyes on the crazed plane as a bolt of fear shot through his spine for the first time in the battle. If he hit the tower, he would cripple the carrier as well as wipe out their top officers. Hundreds of rounds of anti-aircraft fire continued to stream into the air, but were failing to stop the Marauder as it bore down on the helpless ship, rapidly coming closer and closer. The eyes of all inside the bridge tower grew wide. Fuchida couldn't believe that Americans had this kind of bravery and zeal for their country to launch a suicide attack. In a matter of seconds, the tower could be instantly pulverized. The officers instinctively ducked as the plane roared past, missing the tower by mere feet, cartwheeling into flaming shreds into the ocean. A curtain of white spray slowly drifted down to the sea over the sinking wreckage. "Enough!" Nagumo shouted. "Midway's air base must be neutralized. Rearm all reserve bombers with land bombs for a second wave. Immediately!" In the hangar below, Kanagasaki and his aircrew leaned against the wall, watching a Zero fighter descend on the elevator platform to be refueled and rearmed when the intercom blared out. "Attention! Prepare to carry out second assault. Re-equip aircraft with land bombs." Kanagasaki looked at his men, perplexed. Switching over a Type 97 bomber from a 17-foot torpedo to 8-foot land bomb was far easier said than done. Their 5-man crew would have to lower the 1,760-pound torpedo onto a cart, unbolt the mounting bracket, and install a completely different bracket on each plane before they could begin to attach the land bombs, a 90-minute procedure, and they had only enough engineers to do 6 at a time. On a normal rolling sea, it was difficult. During evasive maneuvers, it was nearly impossible. Sighing hard, Kanagasaki waved a mechanic over to wheel an empty cart for a torpedo secured to one of the bellies of the 17 aircraft in his group. The carrier cargo was given the same instructions, and the dive bombers on the carriers were also to switch to land bombs. Nearly 200 aircraft would have to be systematically switched over. About 250 miles northeast of Nagumo's carriers, a light grey Aichi E-13A scout plane with pontoons droned through the sky. As the observer routinely looked down through patchy clouds, he saw what appeared to be foam trails and wakes on the ocean surface reflecting the morning sunlight. He fumbled for his binoculars and focused in. 7:53 a.m. In the bridge of the Akagi, Genda smiled as he received a note from a courier. "Admiral, the battle group reports not a single hit on any fleet vessels." Nagumo nodded. An officer peering through one of the mounted long-range binoculars inside the tower called out, "Admiral, the battleship Kirishima is laying down smoke." On the deck below, Fuchida knew this meant another wave of attack aircraft was approaching their fleet, and this was bad timing. Only 20 minutes earlier they had 33 Zero fighters in the air protecting the fleet. Now they had merely 13, since most of the fighters were being refueled and rearmed.